Hi, I'm John,
And I'm Meredith.
and this is No Talking in the Library. Today we're going to talk about some more music. There's a theme here, probably a couple, but one is I was just sort of reading about the controversy that's been going on about Dolly Parton coming out and saying that she supported BLM, and then some other sort of people being very critical of that. And I have a lot of respect for Dolly Parton for this reason. She has clearly gotten to the point in her career that she doesn't care anymore about.
Also, that's crazy because Dolly Parton has always been on the side of like social justice and, equality. So it's like crazy to think that like this is a new thing for her.
That's right. I mean, she came out in support of gay marriage like a long time ago. But I think it's kind of cool that, Dolly Parton, and I think she clearly recognizes this, has the opportunity to do this because she's extremely famous, doesn't really need to worry about alienating people. But so one of the reasons this comes up is because one of the records that we're going to talk about today is the new record by the Chicks, formerly the Dixie Chicks, called Gaslighter. And that kind of issue comes up quite prominently in their history as
Probably, arguably, one of the most famous examples of backlash for speaking out. Like the media era and entertainment industry.
Sure. I mean, for those who don't remember, they during the early Aughties made comments about George W. Bush, and people were very upset by that. And it highlighted a couple of things. The first of which being like, because they were country music artists, they were, I think, the fan base for that is going to not react to that sort of thing very well. But also because they're women, and if it's Dave Matthews making that comment or Toby Keith, just to take.
I was gonna say Toby Keith is like the one that really jumps to mind in terms of like that early 2000s like American jingoism, like I'm gonna put a boot up your ass because it's the American way,
right,
sort of feeling that a lot of the country had at that point.
Right. And they really, radio stations were like staging like, burn Dixie Chicks records events and stuff like that. And they had a lot of problems getting basically booted off of country music radio. And this is a band that was one of the biggest selling country music acts of the 90s. And they had really made that jump outside of the country music sort of area, so that, I used to see Cowboy Take Me Away on MTV. All the video for that was on heavy rotation.
And I think that's saying something, that they were one of the best selling female country music acts at that time, because that was really at the height of women in country music. You had Shania Twain's Come On Over, you had Faith Hill, Reba McEntire, Martina McBride. Like all of those women were, performing and stuff during that era. So for one to stand out like the Dixie Chicks, I think is saying something.
They then put out Taking the Long Way in 2006, which was a sort of comeback record. It had the sort of the lead track, Not Ready to Make Nice, which was sort of Natalie Maines, the sort of main singer, coming out and saying, sort of telling the story of it, but also saying,
she does not apologize and shouldn't have to apologize for having an opinion against. And the fact of the matter is that by now, public opinion has turned the other way to realize that they were right. So take that.
Yeah, she really, she just let everybody know that they were just completely unapologetic. They had gotten, in addition to the sort of professional problems they had, they all got death threats. That's a startling thing, to send a death threat to a young woman because, over something like that. To send a death threat to anyone for any reason, obviously, is repugnant. But particularly this case highlights, something in particular. So, and then they didn't put out an album between 2006 and July of this year. I think Gaslighter came out on the 17th. From what I read, they were just planning on putting out an album of cover songs because they had a sort of label obligation. And then Natalie Maines, her marriage to Adrian Pasdar broke up, and this prompted her to start writing again. And in the course of their divorce, apparently, this is common knowledge to everybody, so I'm not breaking any crazy confidences or whatever, but he sued to invalidate their prenuptial agreement to make her pay him alimony, I think. And then once he had done this, he also wanted to claim that he got to look at the lyrics of all the songs she was writing to make sure that none of them violated the prenuptial agreement. And the judge.
I don't know if you could see me because I think you were talking, but I just rolled my eyes like all the way out of my head.
I know, I could see your head sort of move side to side as your eyes carried it that way. But yeah, and and the judge eventually ruled, and I think quite reasonably, you can't have it both ways. If you're going to sue to invalidate the prenup about the one thing, sorry, she gets to write all kinds of songs about you, which she did. And this record is just absolutely, in a lot of respects, a sort of catalog of her bad feelings toward him, which is fine. I mean, it's completely legit. I don't think it in any way detracts from the music. In a way, I think it's kind of cool in the sense that you're really getting a very raw, look into what's up with Natalie Maines and her feelings about the way things went.
Mostly, I'm glad that their career has managed to sustain through that period when they weren't making music, where the opinion about the Chicks was more of the negative. I mean, they did release those 2 albums. I guess technically they were touring home, I believe, when Natalie Maines made the comment about George Bush. But the opinion about that taking the long way really it didn't make the splash quite like what Gaslighter is doing now, when people are realizing that, yes, we were, entered into a never-ending war in the Middle East. Yes, it was fine to have those opinions. And so I was such a huge Dixie Chicks fan when I was like in middle school. Wide Open Spaces and Fly, which their first 2 big albums that they had out. And when 9/11 happened, and when the Dixie Chicks made these comments, I was only in middle school. I was a freshman at the time, and I didn't really understand why it was happening, I guess. Why people were so angry about, or I guess I understood why people were angry, but I guess I didn't fully understand like why it was important that they were standing up and standing out against, going into this conflict. Later on, I did watch Shut Up and Sing, which is the 2006 documentary about, these events and all of the backlash and fallout that happened. And so, it sort of filled in those gaps. But really, there's such a talented group. And Gaslighter, the lead-off single, which is also titled Gaslighter, is such a great song.
Yeah, so the reviews of this have been really quite good. I think it's got a Metacritic score of 87 or 88. Even the one I noticed that was a little bit unfavorable is the one from Rolling Stone, in which the person said that the songs kind of fall into sort of standard types of songs that the Dixie Chicks have done before, that the Chicks have done before. One thing that the writer in Rolling Stone did say that I thought was kind of interesting was that they've really moved away from, they really got started as a kind of almost bluegrass act, not quite, but musicianship is such that I think Marty Guire is like a prize-winning fiddle player.
Yeah.
He's just an absolute virtuoso. And it's true. I mean, part of their kind of move, like country kind of popified in the 90s, the early aughties anyway. I mean, it became sort of stylistically closer to sort of what you want to call pop music or whatever. But they've really, there's a lot of elements of this that are just, you would hear on just sort of mainstream top 40 radio. But it's still got that kind of twang in a way that that some other things, and we're going to talk in a minute here about Taylor Swift's new album, that I didn't kind of quite hear with Taylor Swift. I mean, Taylor Swift is, I think, in a lot of ways moved further away from that. And there are some kind of similarities with Taylor Swift as well. But I will just say that there are some songs on this that don't deal directly with her divorce or whatever, but a lot of them do. And you know, you need to listen to them. I mean, number one, you should just listen to the songs and the quality of their writing and what have you. But also, it's kind of refreshing to hear, you know, young women artists getting out there and just being like, this is what it's like for me. These are the problems that I really have, and this is what my life is really like. And it kind of sort of emphasizes why it's important to hear these women being able to sort of speak out in this way through their art.
Yeah, and to circle back to where you started with Dolly Parton supporting BLM, the Chicks are still out there, you know, using their platform to uplift movements. The March, which is one of the other singles, the video is just like all footage of protests, and I think it lists all of the names of African Americans killed during like police conflicts and the like. So they're still out there doing their thing and not apologizing for it.
Well, yeah, I mean, it really just highlights that, you know, their sort of attitude that, okay, like, if you don't, like, the gloves are off, like, you know, they don't really care anymore, and they're going to sell out stadiums, they're going to sell records, and that's great. I mean, that's really, you know, if you don't agree with what they're all about, that's fine, but they've really just decided, like, we're gonna make the music that we're gonna make, and be happy and content with the consequences. Which brings us to Taylor Swift.
Taylor Swift, a little bit of a different album, but similar in the sense that we've got a country music artist who has made the transition to pop. This album came out just at the end of last month. I would say I'm a casual Taylor Swift fan. What about you?
I like a lot of her songs. There's some songs that I find, I'll just say, before I worked here, one thing I did was coached high school volleyball, and this was when "We're Never Getting Back Together" was a big song, and it was like it was the warm-up music for every volleyball match, and the girls on the team would sing it on the bus to the match, from the match. It took me a while to sort of understand what it was that they sang. I mean, it's a good song, but why it was important to them was because, like, the big thing in their lives is, or one big thing is, not feeling like they're in control of, you know, their emotional life and their relationships. And here's Taylor Swift coming out and saying, well, look, like, I'm in control of this situation. Like, I'm gonna, you know, if I'm not getting treated the way I want to be treated, if you're not doing right by me, then I'm just not having it. And that was something that I think was really powerful and really spoke to them. And she does these songs, you know, she writes a lot of good songs, but she does these songs too that really sort of, that are kind of self-conscious. So I'll Write Your Name is another one where
Blank
I'll Write Your
Space.
Name. Right. You know, it's about her. She had this sort of like reputation as a kind of a man-eater because she had a lot of boyfriends, or she had several. And then she would write, when it went wrong, she would write about it. And you know, at first when I heard this, I was like, well, God, you know, that's kind of like her sort of using her platform, but whatever, like, that's her emotional life, and she has a right to say it. And it gets read a certain way because she's a woman. Like, if a male artist comes out and says these things, and everyone's like, you know, whatever. But because she's not, I don't think I'd necessarily listen to like a whole Taylor Swift album front to back until I listened to Folklore.
Yeah, I'm in the same position. I mean, I listen to Taylor Swift on the radio, I'll sing along. The closest I ever came to like really being into a Taylor Swift album was probably 1989. That's the album that has Blank Space, Shake It Off, Bad Blood, Wildest Dreams. I'm sure I've downloaded a Taylor Swift song. I'm pretty sure I downloaded Shake It Off to put on like a running playlist. But at the end of last month, she unexpectedly announced one night on Twitter that she was releasing an album the next day. And I thought that was kind of a big deal for a couple of reasons. One, apparently Taylor Swift is like a very strict, like control freak about releasing her music and the way it is rolled out. So for her to just like announce that she's dropping one is kind of a big deal. And then second, this album, unlike Gaslighter, which came out during the middle of this pandemic, but it was recorded before it started and was supposed to be released in March. Folklore was an album sort of conceived and written and recorded in the middle of the pandemic. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think this is like the first big piece of media that's been released, you know, that was created during this COVID pandemic.
Yeah, I think you're right. And one sort of interesting part of it is that she managed to collaborate with other people. So the one of the producers is Aaron Dessner, who's guitar on the National. She did a collaborative piece with Bon Iver that's really one of the more startling, and we could talk about the songs, but that song is a really startling piece of music.
Yeah. So the album cover was, I think, what really grabbed me. It's a black and white forest, you know, photograph, Taylor Swift. It was just a little different than the energy and the image that Taylor Swift usually has, especially her last album, which was only a year ago, was all very like pastel, bright colors. And I listened to it, it was streaming on a bunch of different websites, and I was about halfway through it when I was like, I have to have this album, and I bought it right then and there. And it is a phenomenal album. She's really making the transition. She's made the transition from country to pop, and this album, she's made the transition from pop to almost indie, like folk music, not necessarily folk, but like indie rock, indie pop. The energy of the album is, you know, all very low key. You don't have like a big pop number like Shake It Off or anything like that. And it's really, really wonderful.
Yeah, it's very different than, I mean, if your image of Taylor Swift is like I'll Write Your Name or Mean or any one of the sort of like more popular Taylor Swift songs, this is going to be very different. Just to highlight one sort of what I was mentioning sort of previously, the track that she did with Bon Iver, which I think is Exile.
Yeah.
It starts very low key with a kind of like, you know, piano type. And then it just builds and builds and builds, and they keep adding sounds and adding sounds. So it kind of like, at the end, you get this kind of like swelling, sort of enormous sounding song it's very different. I mean, it has a very different feel or texture to it than a lot of Taylor Swift songs, and it's incredibly beautiful. I mean, it's really, it makes use of her voice, which is, and the contrast with the guy from Bon Iver, and so it's very like there's a really beautiful sort of contrasting, but also intermixing of two very talented vocalists. And then there's a song about the woman who owned the house that she lives in Rhode Island. That I thought was really interesting too, because it's another one of these sort of like, you know, let me tell you about this story about this woman that I found very affecting because people didn't like the way she was and she just didn't care. And that's, you know, a very Taylor Swift kind of thing in this.
Yeah. Like you were saying, a lot of her songs and a lot of her albums are like, let me, you know, write 12 songs about my breakup with this guy. The Folklore album, each song, I think from what I've read, the idea for Folklore came from her sort of imagining the stories and the lives and the stories of other people and other points of view. So each song is a little bit different. Last Great American Dynasty, the one about the woman who owned the house, is like about new money. The song I really like, Betty, is sort of a high schooler dealing with Gossip and like First Love. So you get like a really varied tableau of portraits of that she's sort of painting.
Yeah, and she's, every now and then she'll write something about a relationship that's actually going reasonably well. She seems to be a little more sort of at peace with how things are going now. Clearly, if you're going to date Taylor Swift, like, you got to check that box. Like, okay, if this goes south, I'm probably going to end up on top 40 radio and not in the most complimentary way. But maybe that should make you think maybe I'll behave myself and not act like a jerk. She seems to have taken the opportunity to really like flesh out a lot of these songs. Like if you listen closely to these tracks, there's really a lot going on. I've listened to this record 4 or 5 times now, and every time I listen to it, I hear something that I didn't catch before, like a sort of something that's in the songs, something that the way that the melodies relate to each other, something that's sort of like overlaying. And it's really, this in a way, the point you were making earlier about sort of what it means in her kind of stylistic trajectory, I think is exactly right. It's really, this is her taking it to a whole other artistic level than she was at, like even having sort of, there's a banjo song on this too, just to sort of remind you that she used to be a sort of like notionally a country music act, but
the other thing sorry.
No, go ahead.
The other thing I really like about Betty is that, well, first of all, this album is not just for an album that was recorded and written during the last couple of months. It's not just a couple of singles or an EP. It's like a full 16 song, hour plus record, which is impressive. But Betty is really reminiscent to me of Sixpence None the Richer's Kiss Me, which I think is one of the finest, indie pop songs ever. I just, love it. So to hear a song that's sort of reminiscent of that, I think there's a harmonica instead of a accordion.
Yeah, that Sixpence None the Richer song is really great, although for some reason I always want to call them Sixpence None the Wiser, but that's neither here nor there. I think this record has a lot of stuff for people who are already Taylor Swift fans. I think if you're one of that small number of human beings who have not heard Taylor Swift and are inclined to this, to popular music, there's just this album is just hours of listening enjoyment waiting for you, because it's really just she's just incredibly, just almost annoyingly talented and creative. I mean, it's really like,
she is just I probably one of the finest, greatest, musicians, just prolific,
right.
Talented of the era.
Sure, people for a long time tried to sort of pigeonhole her because she's pretty and blonde, and she's but if you listen to her
great
interviews,
songs about love, and she plays her guitar.
Right. But if you listen to her interviews, she's really smart, and she's really very aware of sort of what her position is and how she wants to present herself and project herself. And I'm not surprised she's I've definitely heard that same thing about her being a control freak about things. And it's not surprising because, she signed this contract when she was 16 or whatever, that she had a lot of trouble getting out from under. And so if that was me, I would be very careful too about how I was, like having reacquired that control about things. Like I would be very, very protective and very invested in like how I was going to present myself or how I was going to be presented.
Well,
right. Well, that was an awful lot of talk about 2 records.
Yeah. Listen to Folklore. It's wonderful.
Yes. And get the new Chicks record too, because it'll really, it's just a great record for, once again, for those of you who are fans of their very excellent earlier catalog, or people just coming to it too. It's a really listenable, enjoyable record. All right. Well, that's it for us. We'll be back next week.
See you next time.